Thank you very much. Um, Thank you for inviting me today and to share in 15 minutes learning from action research with young survivors and wonderful partner agencies over many, many years of working with young survivors. I've been learning along with my colleagues, especially those at the bottom of this slide, Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis, Youth Parliament, Barnardo's, but also lately Young Scot and others, about young people's priorities for action and how they relate to rights conventions. And I would argue if we are going to think the kind of human rights approaches, we really need to take seriously how the CSC and Istanbul Convention recently ratified fit with our approach to gender-based violence. I found Istanbul Convention a little more accessible and specific in relation to violence against women and girls, and at times more specific about children as victims of violence and relational abuse, often of women and children. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but also some concrete things that we've learned about participation and developing principles and ethics for participation too. So I'm going to start with a little story about reference to Voice Against Violence, as some of you might know. I see some familiar faces and others won't, because they existed before the first Equally Safe and were the first young survivor expert advisory group to Cabinet, advising Cabinet and COSLA over 2.5 years. And their work with the people in power and their allies resulted in substantial policy influence, budget setting, and hopefully improved outcomes for children, funding that's now incorporated into DES, for example, a real widening of support for children as an example, or working on the protocol between Police Scotland and Crown Office, trying to shift mindsets about children and violence. They finished 10 years ago, and the reason that I'm bringing them up is because when they saw the first version of Equally Safe, they felt really disappointed that children's rights, they felt, had fallen off the agenda. And so they worked closely with the government for a couple of years to redraft that strategy, along with many other organisations, because they weren't the only ones that felt that children had been dropped off the agenda. And I remember working with COSLA colleagues too to try and think about how we could change things and why they'd fallen off. And whilst agreeing with the gendered approach and the violence against women and girls, the fact that children and young people weren't mentioned in the title was a big thing. But to say violence against women, girls, children, young people certainly wasn't easy to say, and certainly fell off our agenda again. But it was really important to the young people we were working with. So they worked with the commissioner, children's commissioner, to embed participation, and that's where Everyday Heroes came from, that I'm going to talk about today. And to really get that background is hopefully kind of to think about themes for today, like how do we sustain effective, meaningful, empowering participation of children and young people and adult survivors in our services and in our national policy response. It's really difficult to sustain that over time. How do we integrate women and children's rights? I know some of you do that every day in your work, but it seems still really difficult at times in policy making. We know a lot already of children's priorities through our work, your expertise, and also our research, but they need actioned and refreshed alongside children themselves, always drawing in newer and intersectional experiences. I would add, especially in times of crisis, that children's rights and children's experiences of gender-based violence can and do become invisible. I was commissioned to do the Children's Rights Impact Assessment during COVID, which is when I looked at a number of rights instruments and really felt that children became absent in many responses. I know many of you went to great effort to make sure that wasn't true, but in terms of the national response and national public awareness, for example, very little about children and young people. And just lastly, working with children, young people and survivors, and including participation work, requires time and resource, which often is not at foremost, especially in crisis situations, or especially when women and children are in crisis. So Everyday Heroes then was a wonderful collaborative project. I hope most of you have heard of it, and I suppose this is just a refresh as we're refreshing Equally Safe. These hands are brilliant young advisors who worked with us over the year of the project. It was a wonderful, learning, creative, driven, and sometimes very messy and pressured programme. And it was great to see Voice Against Violence mentor other children and young people, and also speak about how participation wasn't just about making things real, but also making change and working together. So these were the aims of the Everyday Heroes programme. You can see how much of a success that has been. I think we've still got a long way to go. I think COVID really stalled progress as well. So I'm going to share with you some of the kind of methods that we use, the pilots we use, and some of our findings. So very quickly then, you've seen the 5 fabulous partners. It was a wonderful meshing of gender-based violence, feminist, children's rights, participation expertise, along with the lived experience expertise. We worked with 17 organisations, and the approach was quite different than what I'm used to, in that we created materials for consultation, created materials and workshops, and then the 17 organisations, I'll give you the names of all of those in the fuller slides that I'll share with you after the event. They then the key workers worked with the children, young people to work with them about their priorities, which was fantastic in terms of the trust, the build and the comfort. But in some ways, it also meant they were a little bit distant sometimes from the people with power. So there were pros and cons, but we reached so many more children and young people than we would have before. And the amount of work they did was phenomenal. So these were the questions that we asked, and it was all about improving services and improving societal attitudes and improving the justice system. And this was an example of different responses from children about being taken seriously. There was a lot of information about justice service needing improved and the justice system, and about support and what worked and what didn't, and some brilliant light bulb moments about gender equality as well. So some of these that I'm going to share have been acted upon, some by yourselves, but I would argue we've still got a long way to go with some. And this was something I picked out because Scottish Children's Aid and I were analysing the justice responses, and we nearly missed this in our first quick analysis, because I think we hoped that we were getting somewhere. But still, again and again, over like 30 years of action research, this overall priority to reassure children that it's okay to report abuse, they'll be believed, listened to and supported, still came up so often with so many children, young people and different age groups and genders. And though it sounds like our bread and butter, it's what we do, it was really disappointing and concerning, and we really needed to still think about public awareness. And that children just still need to learn about speaking out, which is really, and more important, more obviously, we as professionals need to be able to listen. And the responses, especially at schools, and I know a lot of work has now been done at schools, was very poor in terms of responses. And I think that we forgot about that again in the COVID response, at least nationally. I know there was some work was done, but about this campaign in public awareness, and that young people, Yellow were an example, Aware in Angus, and there were other local examples of children, young people acting because they felt the government wasn't acting to let children know there was help available. And, you know, there was no one for there to walk in. They obviously missed out in terms of school and being a major source of help. And I really felt they became quite invisible, but there are some brilliant local initiatives, at least eventually, like Edinburgh Council and the Women's Aid Safe Hubs, ways of actually getting some support. So yeah, just an obvious, but I think we need to keep saying this one as, you know, one of the most important things about improving our response. So to talk about improving services and improving and then improving justice responses. This is where I think, like, Article 39 of the CRC is about the right of children experiencing violence and abuse to support and physical and psychological recovery. And I think we're a long way to providing that for the length of time that children need it and the immediacy of that need. And though there are some brilliant examples that we're going to hear of later of agencies that are providing some amazing support, but again, there's waiting times and real lack of support workers. So improving, you'll know that in terms of the training of agencies, it was especially education, police and health that children talked about in relation to that. in terms of the welcoming spaces, that was in terms of mental health spaces, interestingly, and a lot of justice and police. And I know there was some work done with some everyday heroes about the remote evidence giving, but we've still got a long way to go there, and certainly in summary court, where the majority of domestic abuse cases are heard. And in terms of their involvement in decision making, they often felt out of the room. Much better if they had someone advocating for them, and really not part of, you know, Article 12, which has been part of decision making. And it's here where I think that we could look, when we're looking at rights, we could include rights that are more deemed to be more about women, but actually are about violence against women and girls, such as the Istanbul Convention, and the specificity of those in terms of what we are offering just now. So improving justice responses. Well, there was a very lively debate between some of the everyday heroes and the Solicitor General and Cabinet Sec and COSLA rep at Parliament when they presented these views. And it really was about them feeling excluded from the process, of feeling to blame in the justice process, the horror of cross-examination, and the fact that they really didn't feel that the perpetrator was held to account, and some really heartfelt and difficult things about when it was a peer who was abusing you, as well as when it was a father figure. So a lot about improving the system, the criminal system, and also in terms of contact, especially for those experiencing domestic abuse. Those experienced rape and sexual assault felt the initial responses were panic. When children under 18 especially talked about sexual assault and abuse, and both felt that the justice system needed improving quite dramatically, and that we were a long way from the child-friendly justice guidelines, which I think are really helpful, from the Council of Europe. And the Solicitor General pledged there to reduce the waiting times and the delay times in court. But of course, since then we've had COVID, which has massively impacted on our ability. So gender inequality, gender-based violence, I'm not going to talk about a lot because I see we've got a really interesting speaker next about sexism in schools, but just that I hope these findings will absolutely support the next presentation. And just to say that we worked with partners and who listened very carefully to what was said. There were 5 recommendations about education in particular in this work, and the new curriculum and the work of the equally safe schools, etc., all pledged and did take some of these forward. And so did Young Scott with Rape Crisis and Women's Aid, use their media to develop an online platform, and I see recruiting other young people to improve that. So, you know, some things are happening, but that interactive, and Scottish Women's Aid have been tackling this as well, like how we get an interactive resource that actually works for children and young people. I think it's quite difficult with support workers actually on the other side. So these just a couple of nice slides showing the everyday heroes actually going to Parliament, and there were 2 events. There was a kind of monitoring of their priorities, which I think is really important. Obviously, these young people have moved on now, but who's monitoring these priorities and making sure they happen, that they're part of the equally safe refresh? They certainly did make a difference. The government did, and the COSLA did reply to each and every one of the recommendations. I think there's 39. And a year on, they went to see what was happening. They do provide a helpful checklist, I hope, and also please, the alternative version of the slide gives lots of information on each of the priorities, so you can look at what you're interested in. So hopefully we'll talk to the Equally Safe team again, and the importance of continued dialogue with between young survivors and people with power. You've got MSPs, the Cabinet Secretary, Solicitor General, COSLA rep at the time, and this was really a wonderful coming together. And I feel like we maybe lost that a little bit with the last 2 years of not being able to get together whatsoever. And I think we need to come back to how we do that, both locally and nationally. And there's a kind of a lovely drawing of the day at Parliament, but also a reminder that working with artists and experts has been wonderful, and creative work with young survivors is the best way of, in my view, of being able to speak out and speak to people in power on an equal footing. So lastly, to share some ideas about participation. Participation of young survivors in making all of these improvements was hugely recommended. And we also developed some principles, which I'll end with, about empowering equal participation in such spaces. And these were the important principles then. I've put things for you actually to read after today about what was important in terms of space voice. We called it agency, but they preferred action and power to make impact, and support was vital. And the spaces for that work, including the political space, was harder to achieve. So I'll leave that with you. Happy to talk to you about that in the questions. And these are lots of resources that I hope will help you further. And yes, you'll all get the slides, and happy to talk about them. I think that's my 15. So thank you very much for listening.